Hi, this is Ron Cipcic, and this is the fourth part of a six-part series on aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis. In this particular segment, we're going to take a look at economic growth. In particular, we'll derive the long-run aggregate supply curve, and then we'll show how economic growth, the factors that cause economic growth, shift the aggregate supply curve, the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. What we have showing now is a short-run model. Notice that the aggregate supply curve here is upward sloping. So this is actually what we would call a short-run aggregate supply curve. And if you have studied the aggregate supply curve some, you've already learned that the upward sloping aggregate supply curve is caused by something termed a wage lag effect. And that's how you get this upward sloping function. We are not going to explain the wage lag effect. That is in an earlier lesson, but we assume that we begin the analysis with a short-run model. Now, let's suppose that the aggregate demand curve slides to the left. This is called a contractionary demand shock. And let me go ahead and label that. So we shift to the left. We have AD2 over here to the left. Price level drops, PE1 to PE2, and output falls below the natural rate down to Y2. Okay? Now, I'll move this up a little bit so we can see it. Now, in a classical view, we talked about the classical view in one of our earlier videos. If we're working with a classical view, then we know that workers are going to take pay cuts, and the aggregate supply curve is actually going to shift back to the right. So let me show you this. Let's assume that workers adjust to these potential layoffs by wanting to take pay cuts. So let's read down vertically from point 1 to the new aggregate demand curve and put a point 3 in there. And then what we want to do is we want to shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. So let's do that. Afraid I didn't do it very well. Let's try it again. There we go. So the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, and that is caused by a drop in wages. Okay, so lower wages are pushing the aggregate supply curve to the right. Excuse me, pushing it to the right, and the effect of that is to move the economy back towards full employment. So as we shift that aggregate supply curve to the right, the price level falls even further. Notice that the price level falls. This is called deflation, but output returns to or near the natural rate. All right, so the wage adjustment here actually brings the economy back to full employment. Now, this was discussed at length in the classical segment, and I don't want to go through all of this again, but the point I'm trying to make is here you have a drop in aggregate demand that is compensated for by lower wages. So in essence, what the classicals argue is that the economy, if all wage adjustments take place, if prices and wages are flexible, the economy operates at or near the natural rate. So in the long run, we assume that all wage adjustments have taken place. So in other words, notice the economy is operating always at the natural rate in the long run. If all wage adjustments take place, notice point 1, let me get back to the right function here, point 1 and point 3 are at the natural rate. Why? Because wage adjustments, price and wage adjustments, have brought the economy back into full employment. Well, this vertical line right here is the long-run aggregate supply curve. And the long-run aggregate supply curve assumes that all wage adjustments, I think I can write that a little bit better. Let's try to clean this up a little bit. all wage adjustments have taken place. Okay, so notice when you're out here at point 2 is off the long-run aggregate supply curve. You're basically off the long-run aggregate supply curve when wage adjustments haven't taken place. And this is the Keynesian view. Remember, the Keynesian view is the economy doesn't move from 1 to 2 to 3, that the economy may move from 1 to 2 and sit at 2 for a long time unless government steps in and stimulates the aggregate demand curve back to the right. We've already talked about this in earlier segments. But what we're showing here is assuming that all wage adjustments take place, you're going to be back to the natural rate. So in the long run analysis, you assume some things. Let me go ahead and scroll down and I'll write these things down for you. When you're doing long run analysis, in long run analysis, you assume some things. One, you assume that there is no wage lag effect. In other words, wages are not lagging prices. That wage adjustments are complete. Okay? And so we'll just write this out. All wage adjustments take place. So what we're assuming here is the time interval is long enough for workers to adjust their wages to price level changes. That's really the big idea. And then number 2, notice that in the short run we never moved YN. We never moved YN in the short run analysis. The first 3 segments we held YN constant. But now we're going to assume that YN can move. So the natural rate of output can change in the long run. And in the short run, the natural rate cannot change. The natural rate of output cannot change because all you can change in the short run to affect output is the number of workers. But in the long run, you can change technology, you can actually take actions to try to improve worker productivity. There's all sorts of things you can do in the long run to boost output that you can't do in the short run. So YN can move, we'll assume, in the long run. And then there's one other bullet I'd like to put in here. I'd like to say in the long run, the focus is not on unemployment and business fluctuations. Remember, in our short run analysis, we were primarily concerned about the problem of cyclical unemployment and low real GDP caused by weak business conditions. But we're no longer concerned about that in the long run. In the long run, the focus will be on 2 problems. One, the focus will be on economic growth. What can be done to promote the size of the system? What can be done to boost GDP in the long run? And B, we're concerned about something called inflation. Inflation is considered a long-run problem. And we'll be talking more about that. Okay? Well, let's go ahead then, and I want to move down a little bit further and show how we use this long-run aggregate supply curve to illustrate economic growth. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll set up very quickly here a model. And we're going to use a vertical aggregate supply model. And we'll just label this AS1. And this down here will be YN1. As I proved up above, in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical and it resides at the natural rate. Let's go ahead and look at that again. The aggregate supply curve is vertical, and where does it reside? It resides where? At the natural rate. Okay, so we're not going to draw in all this other stuff. We're just going to draw in the vertical line. Okay, so let me move back down there. Now, let's just for the sake of argument, let's say that YN1 is 1914, the United States in 1914. In 1914, I was not alive. In 1914, the United States economy had a potential or natural level of output. However, that natural or potential rate of output was much lower than it is today. The United States today, in 2014, 100 years later, is much more productive, potentially, than what it was 100 years ago. Even if we're in a very severe recession today, even if our output rate is very depressed by today's standards, we would be producing not only a lot more output, but we're producing a much higher quality of output than was produced 100 years ago. That is that's a very, very easy proposition to defend. So what has happened over the last 100 years is the natural rate of output has increased in the United States dramatically. And this movement is shown by shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. So let's go ahead and label this YN2, and this is 2014. Better finish labeling, put a P over here. This is the price level. Okay, so what has caused this movement? Well, any factors that promote what? Factors that promote growth. So anything that promotes economic growth is going to push the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Anything that inhibits growth, and you'll be reading about some factors that can do that, but anything that inhibits growth is going to shift the aggregate supply curve, long-run aggregate supply curve, back to the left. And there are things that can inhibit growth, that can prevent the system from growing. You'll actually read about that. So I'm going to list some of the factors that could promote growth here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. You'll be reading about them, but I do want to mention them. Probably the number one factor that has shifted that long-run aggregate supply curve to the right in the United States would be technological innovation. So technology is a driving force behind economic growth, and the United States has experienced tremendous economic growth due to technological innovation and breakthrough. Number two, how about abundant natural resources? Countries that have large quantities of natural resources are going to be in a position to grow faster than countries that lack these resources. So the United States has certainly benefited from its minerals and its wood, its large forests and lumber, by its waterways, and I could go on and on and on. The United States is tremendously blessed with natural resources. Even today, it's oil resources. We're discovering oil today in places we thought, we thought we'd pretty much exhausted our oil reserves here in the United States, but in fact, we have some of the largest oil fields in the world today. Now we're having to use new technological methods to get to this oil. The easiest oil to remove from the United States has been removed, but the point is we have enormous oil fields and coal fields and natural gas fields. Now, one problem obviously with using oil and natural gas and coal are the carbon emissions. So these are not generally considered to be clean fuels, but the point is, they have very much driven growth in the United States. Look at Saudi Arabia. What would Saudi Arabia be today without its oil reserves? Not be a shadow of the country it is today. Okay, so abundant natural resources are a key factor. Three, this may be surprising to you, reasonable population growth. It's important that a country's population grow. If the output rate is to grow, you're going to need more people to work. And obviously workers need to be replaced because they age, they become less productive, they die. And so a nation's labor force must be replaced. And while today we use a lot less manual labor to get things done, we still need people to work, to think, to create. And the idea that you can get by with declining population growth rates, economists, particularly macroeconomists, just don't believe this. They believe the evidence is clear that nations that have reasonable population growth rates are going to grow faster than nations that don't. There are places in the world today, like Western Europe, that have very, very low and even declining population growth rates. And these nations, if you look out 10, 20 years from now, it's a very depressing forecast for these nations because either they're going to have to import workers or they're going to decline. All right, so you don't want your population growth rate to be explosive, however, because if it's explosive, say India, maybe 25, 30 years ago, India had explosive growth rates, then you're going to be devoting almost all of your resources to feeding people, and you won't be able to save and invest and build your capital stock. Okay, so reasonable population growth is a key factor. Let me just list a couple more of these and we'll wrap up this particular lesson. Number 4. We'll put number 4. I'll just put number 4 down here. Capital formation. I alluded to this in number 3. Actually, these are all connected. You'll see that you can't really employ abundant natural resources if you don't have technological means to do that. And reasonable population growth rate still allows you to form capital. In other words, you're still able to save, and when you can save, you can invest, and when you can invest, you can actually create capital structures that allow for greater growth. So nations that can save and don't have to consume all of their output can invest, and nations that can invest can increase their capital stock. So investment in machinery and buildings and even public investment, highway systems, sewer systems, water drainage systems, could go on and on and on, lighting systems. All of these systems help promote growth. All right, let's keep going here. Go down to number 5. Another key factor would be improvements in worker productivity, higher worker productivity. Now, there's lots of things that affect worker productivity. You could do a whole segment and lesson on this. I can teach courses on what causes improvements in productivity. But the key idea here is that workers have improved in their productivity over time, and you can look at things like education. You can look at things like healthcare. All of these things have contributed to better worker productivity. If people are more educated, they can compute, they're literate, they can communicate. If they're healthy, these are things that will contribute to greater worker productivity. And we could go on and on and on there. And then number 6, the last factor here will be what I call pro-growth economic/political systems. Systems that encourage growth, political systems and economic systems that encourage growth will get more growth. And generally what we're going to be looking at are low tax systems, systems that don't overtax citizens. When you overtax citizens, you discourage work and creativity. The most fruitful people do not want to see most of the fruit of their labor taxed away, so low tax systems tend to promote growth, and low regulation systems. Now, we're not saying there shouldn't be something called the Clean Air Act, and there shouldn't be regulations on business, environmental regulations, safety regulations, those sorts of things. For instance, safety regulations can actually improve worker productivity. If workers are being harmed by their work environment, being hurt, or are getting sick because of their work environment, they're not going to be more productive. All right, so regulations, we're not saying no regulations, but systems that over-regulate the business sector, that make it difficult for people to be creative, make it be difficult for them to be productive, those will discourage growth. So low tax, low reg systems tend to be high growth systems. All right? Okay, this concludes segment number 4 on economic growth. And we'll be using these tools in segments 5 and 6. Thank you.